Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me is actually a 3D print. This officer here, he is from RKX Miniatures, and I'll make sure that there's a link to these in the description. Now I've printed him at home because I wanted to have a shot at painting some US winter infantry since they are, well, front and center of Bolt Action version 3, which is coming out soon. Now the pre-orders for that have gone live, but I haven't got me sticky fingers on any of those winter infantry yet. So I thought, why not have a practice with something that I've actually got accessible to me, and I've had a lot of fun doing it. So as always, all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below. Now I have done winter infantry before, but even if you've seen that one, there are a few differences here which you might find interesting. So let's get started. So whether your miniature is resin, plastic or metal, the first thing to do is to hit it with a primer spray so that your paint has something to stick to. Now if you're able to find a primer which is predominantly the color that your miniature is going to be, that's what you want to use because it will save you a huge amount of time. Now what I've primed this fella with is the leather brown from the Army Painter. This is pretty much perfect for these winter jackets. Alternatively, you could spray this on and then hit this with maybe US Field Drab or Flat Earth. From Vallejo, there's also Steel Legion Drab from Citadel, which is quite close. Remember that when these jackets were manufactured, off they went into the real world. And you would get fade, you would get them wet, so they would be darker. What you want is a color that's close enough. Any middling, desaturated brown will work just fine for this. So, leather brown it is. And the bonus here as well is that because so much of this is going to be the primer color, we can actually be quite messy applying the rest of our base coats and then just do a little bit of tidy up at the end. And when it comes to those base coats, I'm going to start with his skin. Now what I've got here is actually a mix. This isn't something that you'll strictly need to do yourself. What I've done is got topaz skin from the Army Painter and mixed in just a tiny wee bit of barbarian flesh to lighten it up slightly. What you could do instead would be to just grab something like, what is it, topaz skin or jasper skin. Painting skin, of course, is up to how you want it to look. So I like this because when we shade this later, it's not going to end up seriously dark. But 2 coats of this. Now, ordinarily on my miniatures, I tend not to bother painting the eyes because we're looking at them from table distance. The scales involved, you wouldn't see a real person's eyes from that sort of distance. But we are painting an officer. We want him to look a little bit cooler than the rank and file. So what I've got is some matte white. Now what we're going to do is do it at this point because we can make a god-awful mess of his face and still tidy it up. So I'm going to angle him. It's a little tricky with the camera in the way. But go ahead and slash just a horizontal line of white into the eye sockets. Now, from this angle, because his helmet's in the way, it kind of shades his face no matter how I hold him. And I think you can see all the same. I've managed to get that white everywhere except his eyes. But once you've done that and you're satisfied that you have got the eyeball itself white, go ahead and grab some black or a very dark gray or something. And what we'll do is just pop a little vertical line. Because once you've got Lieutenant Bozo's face, those eyes laid in, go back to your base coat for the skin and you can start wicking away and basically painting the outside of the eyes back in so it doesn't look so huge and staring. Now this I am going to do off camera, otherwise it's going to end up wildly unbalanced, but I think you see the principle in purpose here. Now, I'll be honest, it actually took me quite a bit to get those looking halfway decent. You'll probably find it a little easier on most plastic miniatures. The eyes tend to be quite well defined. It's also very staring at the moment, but when we shade him, that is going to go away. What we're going to move on to now is any wooden details, and for this I'm going to use flat brown from Vallejo. Now, you may have seen in the past, if you've watched a previous American painting guide, that I tend to use beige brown for this. But because so much of his coat, is quite a neutral brown, I'm using a slightly warmer brown for the wooden details this time. It's maybe a little, it's still quite close to accurate, but it is a deliberate style choice here. You could use beige brown, stick to how everything else looks, but I think this is going to look a little bit more interesting on our predominantly brown miniatures. Now, to paint in his trousers, ironically enough, we're actually using a color called Russian uniform, World War II. This here, it's good for a sort of faded, slightly worn green for the uniform. You will probably not need very much of this, as most miniatures you'll find, they've got the coat pulled quite close around them, like this dude does. And again, at this point in the war, you're going to see more green equipment than beige. So what I have here to paint in his webbing is going to be green-gray. Now, in true Vallejo fashion, there are two colors called green-gray. You're looking for the darker of them. It's 886 on the bottle. Now I'm going to paint in his belt with this, as well as the straps running over his shoulders. But you'll see that he is carrying a canvas bag as well. So I'm going to paint that a different color. As well, after a bit of consideration, I decided to paint in his gloves with the same. We'll make that look a little bit different later on. What we want to do now is to paint in the other canvas materials. And for this, I have Iraqi sand. Now, this is much brighter, and you'll probably find it needs a couple of coats to get a smooth finish on some areas, particularly any large equipment packs and what have you. Now, I want to give a quick shout out while I'm actually here to Hacksaw's Hobby Bunker, who helped me out quite a bit with, he always puts in the comments, unsolicited Geardo nitpick, but I love them because they're always super helpful. So this, for example, don't forget, the strap across the back of the helmet was canvas too. It wasn't actually leather like the one over the front, because this was the chin strap pushed back. A little bit there. So if you're watching, buddy, I hope you noticed that you've helped me out quite a bit. Now, once you're satisfied that that has covered properly, what you can do, grab yourself some mahogany brown, which, as well as being one of my favorite colors to say, has a nice warm reddish leather to it. So I'm going to paint the strap across his helmet with this. If you want, you can also paint his boots and shoe packs in with this, but I'm going to use something different, a little bit darker. And no great surprise, what that is going to be is leather brown from Vallejo. As always, add just a little bit of water to your paint to help it flow. You want it to come off the brush fairly easily, but you don't need to add it so much that it's just running around everywhere. Each color, each manufacturer, it does depend a little bit on what you're painting. So experiment with what works for you. And remember that, honestly, too little water, as long as you're not painting huge, thick globs of paint onto the miniature, too little water is honestly a bit easier to work with than far too much. Now we're starting to come into the home stretch. What I'm going to use here, this is German Grey, which is really a very dark, just off black. Has a tiny hint of blue to it, and I like using it as a black because rather than a true black, when we come to shade it, we'll get a little bit of visible variation in our color there. So anything which is going to be either black or metallic, like the details on his carbine here, you can paint those in now. Now for the fella's helmet, what I have here is camo olive green, and I'm going to go over the top of this. It might need a couple of coats depending on how it catches on the top. Remember as well, this little bayonet sheath he's got on the side here, this would be that same painted kind of plasticky finish as well. Easy enough just to paint it the same color here. Now once that has dried, I do see quite commonly questions about how to identify officers and NCOs and stuff like that on the table. Now for certain armies that can be a little more difficult or simple, and I think the US have by far the easiest way going for them. Grab yourself some fresh matte white. And for our officer here, we're going to line up the back of his helmet and just paint a vertical white stripe. And you'll see I'm not being terribly careful about it because I just want it to be in the right place. Then once you've got a decent block of white on there, go back to whatever color you've used for the helmet and we can use this to tidy it up. Now this works super well because as the same in reality, you are most likely going to be standing behind your miniatures, so you'll always be able to see that little stripe on your officers and your NCOs. Once you've got that squared away, what you want to turn to is leather brown. Go right back to the color we used for the primer, and this time out of the pot, we're going to tidy up his coat. Any other bits where you might have splurged over, like his coat is where I've been the messiest, but maybe on his face or on his weapon or what have you, you have something to tidy up, you can do that now. Now once your tidy up is finished, he's ready for a shade. Now whatever you use, I do suggest thin it down. You can chuck Agrak's Earthshade or Strong Tone or something of the like over the top of him, but do thin it down because you want to be able to highlight this guy, if you're going to at all, without having to go back with your base coats anywhere that you can avoid it. So thinning that shade is going to help quite a bit. What I am going to use is good old marine juice, or Sonic Tonic if you don't like saying that. The recipe for this will be in the description. It is basically just a bottle each of Dark Tone, Reichland Flesh Shade, and Lamian Medium. So it's a 3:3:4 ratio. Just a bottle of each is way easier to work out though. I'm using this because it is a little bit softer than Agrak's Earthshade would be, and the added medium is going to help it to stop pooling on big flat areas like on his coat here, and just, oh, magic. Straight away you can see how that's going. So douse the entire miniature in this, and any big flat areas where it pools, while it's still wet, you can shift it away and put it somewhere that it's going to be a bit more useful. So I'm going to drench the entire miniature in this, and then pop them somewhere nice and sunny, give them about half an hour to dry, and see what we get. And once that's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. We've got plenty of shading there, and we haven't dulled down our colors too much. So it's pretty much finished. You could chuck them on the table like that. There's nothing stopping you. Base them up and call them done. But let's take things a little further. What I've got on my palette here, see a little bit of leather brown from earlier, and I'm going to get just the tiniest bit of ivory on my brush and mix that in. Now, most of the highlights I'm going to do today are going to feature the base color with a bit of ivory, because it's a really easy way to get a bunch of colors slightly faded without having to buy 8,000 extra pots. So once I've given this a good mix, it's going to be ever so slightly lighter than our leather brown to start with. So what I want to do here is just some quick vertical lines in a few areas where there's going to be a bit of texture. Now, it will look pretty intense going on, but I tend to find that these ivory mixes, they do dull down a bit as they dry, so don't be too concerned if it looks a bit bright going on. Just short, sharp lines. So we want this to look a little bit more woolen. You can also use this, just little dibbly bits on his chest. And yeah, anywhere that you want to brighten up that leather brown, away we go with some of this mix now. Now, it'll take a bit of practice to get that the way that you like. It is very much a style choice. You'll see on the back here, it's a little bit more scratchy, but I kind of like it. Matter of taste, you might like how that looks. All the same, I'm now going to grab just a little bit more ivory and mix that into some more of that leather brown. If you're working quickly, you can use the same mix on your palette for this. And what I'm going to do now is catch just a few of the edges for a slightly more pronounced highlight there. Now, if you don't like how that's turned out, if you think it's a little bit too light, what you can do is go over the top of it with another dark shade. I'm not going to because I am quite happy with that, but it's worth pointing out, if you're worried that you've overdone it, you can just shade it back down. What I'm going to do now is the same thing again, using ivory and the base coat. I'm going to do this for the green-gray on his gloves and webbing, and also the Iraqi sand on the other one. So I'm going to skip over this a little bit. Now on his gloves, I did take that a little bit further by adding just a touch more ivory and going back over his knuckles with a couple of little scratchy highlights to try and make the wool on that stand out a bit. Whether it worked or not, I don't know. I think it looks pretty cool. I've got now Cadian flesh tone, and I'm going to paint in my face the way I normally do. So I am going to cover over most of his skin with this, particularly with having mixed up the base coat for his skin. Leave his bottom lip as it is, because that's quite a warm tone, and it will look quite natural without having to come and paint over the top of it with like a red wash or something. So, leaving a little bit of that in the recesses. Now that can take a bit of practice, because it does require quite a bit of control of where your paint is going. But the easiest tip I can always give you is don't have very much paint on your brush when you're doing this. So I've got now Kislev flesh, and I'm going to highlight bits like his chin, the tip of his nose, and his cheekbones a little bit more. But I'm going to do this off camera so it's a bit easier for me. Okay, at this point I am just being extra. What I've got is some flayed one flesh, and I'm going to do the very tip of his nose, and I'm going to paint a little bit of a cleft chin on him with this. Then if you are feeling particularly extra, what you can do is load up a brush with some Apothecary White. It's a contrast color. Get most of it off there. I'm going to paint in basically where we would expect to find a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow. Just back and forth over that area a little. You don't want to overdo it, because at this point, not enough is going to look better than too much. Now that will hopefully be a bit more visible in the finished product when we get a photo of that at the end. So what I'm going to do now is pop a varnish on them. Now I'm brushing on here, this is Instar's Varnish Plus. And I like a brush on varnish because I don't have to worry too much about atmospheric conditions. This will just tie everything together and give us a nice even finish on the miniature. Now you'll see, in the meantime, I have quickly bodged on a layer of Stirland Mud. I'm going to put the recipe for the base in the description too. But what I have here is one of my nice soft pencils. This is a B. You can also use a 2B, so it's 2B or not 2B, which I never get sick of. I am going to very lightly just buff this along the edge of some of the metallic details. It's important to do this after your varnish, because the varnish will give a very faint surface to the miniature, which will pick up that buff. So, just a little across the back of the barrel to give it a faint gunmetal sort of look. And same too on his field glasses. Now you could probably choose to highlight these by painting the edges with a little bit of a true metallic, but I've got this in my hand and it's much quicker. Once that's dried, what I'm going to do is load up my little spatula here with a bunch of Valhallan Blizzard. Now you can use any snow paste or texture paste that you like for this. I just like Valhallan Blizzard because it's got a nice kind of fibrous quality to it. It has a slightly translucent medium that this stuff is all caked into. You'll see at first all I'm doing is just working it onto the base. And these little tufts that I've added, make sure that you are flicking it over and really working it into those as well, because you want it to look like the snow has had plenty of time to settle. Now ordinarily I would leave some of the base showing through, but I really want a properly frozen, fresh snow, really soft look. So what I'm doing here is getting a scrankly old brush. There's always a use for a grubby old brush, don't throw them out if you don't have to. And I am just adding a bit of texture to those big lumps and clumps that I've added. But there is an ulterior motive here, because once I've got the shape I want to my snow drifts, you'll see I've got some of this junk on my brush. What I'm going to do here is just lightly dab at his shoulders, across the top of his helmet, just a little bit of this. Now what's important here is that this Valhallan Blizzard, the actual medium, so that glunky, sticky white stuff you're seeing, that will fade. It'll look a little bit glossy and wet on the miniature, but the actual texture comes from the little chunky bits that are in there. So you want to spend a second just making sure that you do get some of those little white flecks on his gear. Now particularly here, let's say it's been snowing pretty heavily and he's got a little bit of it, oops, maybe not that much, he's got a bit of it caught on his gear here. And so, there at last, our winter infantry is complete. Now this fella was a lot of fun to do, and I think you can see what I mean about the Valhallan Blizzard having a very slight kind of glutinous finish to the medium, but it's still translucent enough that instead what it looks like is the stuff underneath is just a little bit damp. So those little bits of chunky white flakes, they work super well. I love how that turns out. As with any weathering, remember though that it's easy to apply too much, and too little will look better than too much. So until you've got your eye in, just experiment a little bit, maybe on some basic infantry, and see what you like the look of. Don't overdo it. You don't have to rush yourself. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and importantly resin, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you so much for your support, folks. You really are the ones who keep this channel going. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.